let's get to our weekly money news roundup, where we break down the latest in the world of finance to help you be smarter with your money.
Now, if you've been to the grocery store and it's giving you a heart attack at the checkout, like it has me, but I'm still here, don't worry. It's not the bacon and pancakes in your car. It's high prices. And our news colleague, Anna Helhoski, talked to an expert with some insights about what is going on at the grocery store.
Here's her conversation with David Ortega, a professor in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University.
David, welcome to Smart Money.
Thanks so much, Anna. Appreciate you having me on.
So take us back a few years. When you're looking at food prices over the last decade, what stands out to you the most?
So when we look at a 10-year horizon when it comes to food prices, so the rate of change in prices, which is what food inflation captures, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic was hovering around 1 or 2% year over year increase. And then when we got into the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular in 2022, we saw a double-digit increase in food prices, more than an 11% increase year over year. And that was the fastest increase since the late 1970s, so about 40 years. Post 2022, we saw food price inflation start to moderate, meaning that the rate of increase has come down, and it's currently hovering around 2.7% for groceries, meaning that groceries today are 2.7% higher than they were a year ago. We've moderated the rate of increase, but that doesn't mean that prices are coming down. It just means that they're not increasing as much as they were back in 2022 when we were looking at those double-digit increases.
So quite a bit of what we're seeing in food prices today can be traced back to the pandemic then. What's changed in the food system that isn't necessarily likely to reverse?
The prices that we're looking at today at the grocery store, the price level captures the increases that we saw starting with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also seen the impacts of climate change on food prices, the impacts on production, the impact of disease like the bird flu that has really affected egg and poultry prices. Also looking at the impacts of policy like the tariffs that have impacted just about a wide range of goods in the economy. And then much more recently, the impacts of the conflict in Iran, what that's done to diesel prices and how that sort of percolates down to food prices. When we're looking at prices today, those increases really factor in all of those shocks that the food system has experienced.
So if you look back again 10 years, how much more expensive is the average grocery basket today than it was then? And are there any particular categories that really shifted in price?
Maybe not even that far, just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So say 2019, grocery prices are more than 30% higher today than they were back in 2019.
Wow.
And if you go even further back, we're looking at even higher increases. And that's just for groceries. When we look at menu prices, which is the cost of food away from home, comparing them today to what they were prior to COVID, and in some cases, we're looking at almost a 40% increase. When we look at groceries, some of the items that have seen the highest increase include things like beef. Beef right now is almost 10% higher than it was just a year ago. And a year ago, those prices were higher than the prior year. When we look at the price of tomatoes, those are significantly more expensive today than they were just last year. Egg prices have been through a bit of a roller coaster ride, and a lot of that has to do with the impacts of the bird flu, what that's done to production. About a year and some months ago, we were looking at record high egg prices. Now those prices have come down considerably because production has caught up. This summer, we've seen the price of lettuce actually plummet in July. A lot of that has to do with the food safety outbreak, the cyclospora outbreak, and what that did to consumer demand. So there's just a lot of variation when it comes to the individual movements of food prices.
So let's talk a little bit about how people are reacting. Are higher food prices changing what Americans may consider normal grocery prices? And could that affect pricing behavior even if inflation continues to cool?
What folks are reacting to at the grocery store is the cumulative effects of inflation. So it's really the price level. And what we're seeing is that even though food inflation has moderated, the price level is significantly higher today than it was back in 2019. And so what that's leading to are changes in shopping behavior. So consumers are trading down. If you're buying premium products, now you're looking for conventional products. We're seeing people making shorter trips to the grocery store, much more frequent trips, so less of that stocking up that we did during the COVID-19 pandemic. They're price comparing much more, taking advantage of discounts that retailers are offering. And we're also seeing an interest in private labels or store brands that sell at a much more affordable price points. But I think it's worth highlighting that these higher prices that consumers are facing, they impact households very differently. So households at the lower end of the income spectrum are squeezed much more, and they are really the ones that are having to make adjustments in order to keep food on the table.
Now, there's another trend that I've been noticing for the last couple of years, and that's that grocery chains are increasingly using dynamic and personalized pricing that's based on demand and inventory, and then changing those prices in real time, a lot like how airlines and ride-sharing services work. But how widespread is this in food retail right now, and what could that mean for shoppers?
So it's certainly a trend that we're seeing gaining some steam. And as you point out, dynamic pricing is really the practice of changing a price based on a change in conditions. And this is nothing new. We see this on the airline industry, but where it's starting to get a lot of attention is sort of a subset of this type of behavior that's known as surveillance pricing, where companies may be using personal data to then target different prices to individual consumers. So looking at price discrimination at the individual level. But it's not something that's widely adopted by any means. There's been, some cases that have gotten some attention, but it's not something that I would consider a widespread activity in the retail sector.
Now, at this stage of the game, have we entered a permanently higher food price environment, or could prices eventually move back toward pre-pandemic trend? I mean, there's been such a massive increase since then. It's a little hard to see that. Are there any specific categories where you would expect any meaningful relief in the next year or so?
In aggregate, once food prices increase, they very rarely come down. That's just not how prices behave. So if we look at the last few decades when it comes to food prices, we've only seen price decreases a couple of times, and they were very short-lived. So you can think of this like a ratchet effect. Once prices tick up, they very rarely come down. That's, again, on the aggregate level. At the product level, there's a lot of movement. So, for example, egg prices have come down, and I believe they're somewhere between 20 and 30% cheaper today than they were a year ago. We can expect to see, prices remain low for eggs, I think, over the next couple of months. But there's still a lot of uncertainty with the nature of the bird flu and what's going to happen with that in the coming months. One area that's a big pain point for many consumers is beef prices. There's very little relief in sight for beef prices. A lot of that has to do with the fact that supply remains very constrained, but there's very strong demand. We're probably looking at higher beef prices for the next few months. When it comes to produce, I think there's just going to be a lot of volatility. As we saw with tomatoes and as we've seen with lettuce, overall, prices tend to increase. And I think that's what we can expect, on average going forward in the next few months. Now, those increases are going to be fairly moderate. So nothing like what we saw back in 2022 when we were looking at those double-digit increases.
And are there any policy levers that could meaningfully bring food prices down, or are most of the forces driving prices up outside of policymakers' control?
There is very little that a policymaker or an elected official can do to lower grocery prices. And that's because prices are set by market forces, so supply and demand. Now, policies can really impact the cost of food. They could make food much more expensive. In the case of tariffs, they are by definition a tax on imports. So tariffs can drive not just the price of imported food up, but also it can drive up the cost of producing food domestically that uses ingredients from abroad. So think chocolate, tropical fruits, those things, if they're taxed, can drive up those prices. Also, when it comes to the cost of labor and immigration enforcement, food is very energy and labor intensive to produce. And so changes in immigration policy, the immigration debate can really constrain the labor force that works in the agricultural sector, and that can drive up prices. What we're seeing now is also the impacts of policy uncertainty, especially when it comes to trade policy, immigration policy. The uncertainty in and of itself can be inflationary because it makes it very difficult for companies to plan ahead, They have to come up with contingency plans, and all of that drives up the cost of doing business. What can policymakers do to help make food much more affordable? There's a lot of buzz and discussion around the issue of affordability, and prices are just one part of the affordability equation. We have to look at wages as well. That really should be the focus. And also the focus should be on the safety net, because again, it's low income households that are impacted the most. So policymakers and policies that help the most vulnerable Americans can go a long way to sort of helping food become much more affordable for that subset of the population. Programs like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, has been key in fighting food insecurity and making food much more affordable for low income households.
All right, David Ortega, professor of food economics and policy at Michigan State University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Anna, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.